Science versus Pseudoscience, Part 4, with Paul Thagard. Welcome to Part 4 of my series on the demarcation between science and pseudoscience. If you haven't yet, I'd highly recommend you go watch Parts 1, 2, and 3, links below. In those, I talked about Karl Popper's notion of falsifiability, Thomas Kuhn's notion of puzzle solving, and Imre Lakatos's progressive research programs. Those videos will help illuminate why Thagard is addressing the discourse in the manner that he does. Even if you don't go back and watch the previous videos, my hope is that this video will be valuable even as a standalone. It's largely uncontroversial to consider something like astrology a pseudoscience, but determining exactly why it's a pseudoscience is difficult. Yet again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but as I've highlighted in previous videos in the series, pseudoscience is like porn. When you see porn, it's really easy to know that you're looking at porn, but determining an explicit criteria that separates all porn from non-porn is easier said than done. Near the beginning of his essay, Why Astrology is a Pseudoscience, Thagard suggests that many common reasons for rejecting the scientific nature of astrology are fundamentally flawed. These main objections highlight the fact that astrology originated from a, quote, magical or mystical worldview, that the planets and stars are far too distant to have a physical or measurable impact on us, more specifically, that there's no known mechanism by which astronomical alignment could influence people, and finally, a psychological explanation that people believe in astrology to provide themselves comfort for their own personal problems. For Thagard, none of these objections show why astrology is a pseudoscience. As for the magical or mystical origins of the discipline, it's hardly a secret that our modern practices of medicine and even chemistry began in disciplines such as alchemy or the occult. Seeing as scarcely anyone would want to remove medicine, and especially chemistry, from the realm of science, the historical origins of a discipline cannot serve as a meaningful demarcation point. Thagard also rejected the psychological explanations of belief in astrology, seeing as people often believe in correct theories for bad reasons and can believe in incorrect theories for good reasons. He is also unconvinced by the lack of mechanism for astrological influence on people. When the theory of continental drift was proposed, there was no known mechanism to explain it, but should that have been classified as a pseudoscience? He also rejects Kuhn's demarcation of, quote, puzzle solving. Please watch Part 2 for more info, seeing as, at least in his own estimate, that astrology too is in the game of puzzle solving. As he describes in Why Astrology is a Pseudoscience, astrologers concern themselves with the solving of puzzles, at least at the level of individual horoscopes, unconcerned with the foundations of their general theory or paradigm. Thagard also has severe doubts that verification or falsification, at least by themselves, can serve as a demarcation criterion. For more details on those problems, I'll urge you to watch my previous videos, Part 1, 2, and 3. Thagard thinks that the demarcation criteria must be as follows. Quote, a theory or discipline which purports to be scientific is pseudoscientific if and only if, 1, it has been less progressive than alternative theories over a long period of time and faced many unsolved problems, but 2, the community of practitioners makes little attempt to develop a theory towards solutions of the problems, shows no concern for the attempts to evaluate the theory in relation to others, and is selective when considering confirmations and disconfirmations. If what's outlined above is our demarcation criteria, we certainly would have no problem jettisoning astrology from the realm of science. Astrology is remarkably non-progressive. The discipline has scarcely changed or even advanced since the time of Ptolemy, and, after a long time, still faces unsolved problems. Astrology has little to no concern with comparing its theory in relation to competing theories regarding the constitution of human subjectivity and psychology. Beyond that, its competitors have been advancing and progressive. Theories of psychology do a much better job at predicting and explaining human behavior than astrology could ever dream of. An interesting consequence of Thagard's theory not unlike the theories of others such as Lakatos or Kuhn, is that the pseudoscientific status of a theory is relative to the historical and social conditions in which it's practiced. As such, a theory can be scientific at one time and pseudoscientific at another, or vice versa. Accordingly, for Thagard, astrology wasn't actually a pseudoscience until the development of modern psychology. This presents a problem for Thagard. Why did many scientists abandon astrology long before the advent of modern psychology? Were they being irrational or unscientific? For Thagard, while there weren't any explicit competitors to astrology at the time, there were many popular thinkers that undermined its plausibility, namely Copernicus, Newton, Descartes, and Hobbes. Their work made astrology appear to be a rather unfruitful endeavor, even though astrology itself didn't have competitors. Science was growing immensely during the 17th century, while astrology stagnated, resulting in its diminishing popularity. This analysis is obviously very similar to the progressive research program versus degenerating research programs theory of demarcation advanced by Lakatos. That being said, it would be important to note that for Thagard, as opposed to Lakatos, progression alone isn't enough. Progression must coincide with the practitioners attempting to reconcile their program with other scientific theories, namely one's competitors. Then they must work towards the solution of those problems within their paradigm. Additionally, going against Lakatos, Thagard suggests that progress alone cannot be the measure of science, as truly scientific endeavors will sometimes lack progress for certain periods of time. Beyond that, a more basic problem, if the Demarcation Criterion requires a competitor to make something a pseudoscience, many fads, such as pyramidology for instance, might not be considered a pseudoscience. Because of such critiques, Thagard went on to revise his ideas of demarcation later in life. Where his early ideas centered around trying to provide necessary and sufficient conditions for science or pseudoscience, he later tried to conceive of demarcation by offering contrasting profiles of each practice. In other words, he abandoned giving a hard line in the sand between the two practices, but simply tried to provide a set of properties that applies to each practice to help us in demarcation. As such, progressiveness and the concern with confirmation and disconfirmation are not necessarily features of science, but are simply often associated with science. Science may or may not always possess these properties, but generally speaking, if an enterprise doesn't possess progressiveness and a concern with confirmation and disconfirmation, one should have reservations with concluding that such a discipline is truly scientific. That being said, with the concession that his demarcation is not the definitive set of the necessary and sufficient conditions for science, he also added two characteristics of pseudoscience. These additional properties of pseudoscience will help one in demarcation of pseudoscience even if the pseudoscience in question has no competitors. The first is that pseudoscience is overflowing with ad hoc hypotheses and unnecessary complexity. An ad hoc form of reasoning would appear as follows. Quote, event B followed event A. Therefore, event A caused B. In more concrete terms, that would look something like, this group of people died after getting their COVID vaccine, therefore the COVID vaccine was their cause of death. As far as unnecessary complexity goes, the example that comes to my mind is exemplified in common conspiracy theories. A conspiracy theorist will suggest that X is true because of Y. Y could be demonstrated to be false, and then they will have to add a layer to the conspiracy to explain away such a problem. For instance, I was talking to a man who believes that while being real, the COVID pandemic is a hoax, a scam, way blown out of proportion. He suggested that the vaccines are more dangerous than the actual virus, that the people dying on an average year from other, quote, normal causes kills more people than COVID, and that the number of hospitalizations could be explained by the fact that people are being tricked and gaslighted by their doctors to go on ventilators. All of these are quite pathetic and demonstrably false, but when presented with the fact that these were all false, He simply suggested that we couldn't trust any of the data that I was providing, that any data I would use was simply a result of a vast and immeasurable conspiracy to cover up the real truth. It's easy to see here how many traits of pseudoscience overlap. One can be adding complexity to the issue while being selective in the data one considers. The second new feature is that pseudoscience will more often than not heavily rely on superficial analogies or resemblance thinking. An example would be seen in astrology. In the astrological practice, Mars, being red, is associated with blood, violence, and war. As such, astrologers will suggest that those born under the influence of Mars will be more likely to be aggressive or violent. It should go without saying that a truly scientific endeavor wouldn't rely on such a faulty mode of reasoning. Even if astrology were true, and the stars one was born under had direct and measurable influence on their personality, it wouldn't follow from that someone born under Mars would tend towards aggression and violence. All this being said, it would be important to note that genuine science does from time to time engage in some of these pseudoscientific characteristics. The existence of these characteristics or properties alone in a practice isn't always indicative that you're dealing with pseudoscience. The difference between science and its imposter in this regard is a difference of degree and not of kind, though for Thagard, that degree is vast and easy to spot. It's easy to tell that a physicist is doing something very different than a palm reader. The same can be said even if the physicist happened to participate in some kind of ad hoc reasoning in a particular instance. So, where do we go from here? What does this mean for our demarcation problem? Thagard certainly has added valuable discourse to the issue by reiterating and expanding upon the social and historical dimension of science originally illuminated by thinkers like Kuhn and Lakatos. But we still don't have that handy-dandy list of properties that we can authoritatively use to demarcate between science and pseudoscience. If we have any ability to demarcate at all, it's always a tentative demarcation, as in the practice in question could change from being truly scientific to pseudoscientific, or vice versa, given the correct social and historical factors. We cannot just examine a theory or practitioner in isolation as a snapshot in time. We have to consider how the theory or theories developed, and how they've been modified, how they deal with problems, and how they deal with data contrary to their views. This, at least for now, concludes my series on the demarcation between science and pseudoscience. As I think I've done a good job of illustrating, the demarcation problem isn't an easy one to thoughtfully address. I'm sorry that I can't just give you a simple and easy criteria by which to determine whether you're dealing with bona fide science or its shoddy imposter. What I believe has been demonstrably shown in examining the quest for a demarcation criterion is that the demarcation criteria is not just that pseudo-intellectual armchair philosopher problem. The demarcation criteria is not just some weird esoteric concern of a few tenured academics. To be deemed a pseudoscience has vast real-world implications on the practitioners. It controls who gets funding, who has legitimacy, who has name recognition, who can work for the CDC, and even who can post on social media. The social and political relevance was clear from the time of Thomas Kuhn when he wrote his Structures of Scientific Revolutions, and it is just as clear today. With issues such as alternative facts about COVID-19 and climate change denial significantly inhibiting our ability to address these problems adequately, the nature of our problem is clear. If we have any hope of a meaningful way to demarcate between science and its imposter, it will require us to more thoughtfully investigate the role that values play in science at large. Perhaps one way to think of the problem would be, instead of asking, what is the demarcation between science and pseudoscience, one could ask, how does the demarcation between science and pseudoscience function? This is the direction I want my Philosophy of Science series to go in. I hope you'll follow me there too. I'd like to say thanks for watching. Special thanks to my patron Ryan Lindsay. Your support means more to me than I can express with words. If you'd like to become a patron yourself to support the future production of these videos, please support me on Patreon. It'll also give you access to an exclusive reading group. Also, check me out on Facebook and Instagram for additional content. Again, thanks for watching.